the dominant culture was being so rigid and politically correct.
You know what's funny to me? When I was coming into journalism, the right is bad at media.
Yeah, right.
And now, almost a decade later,
the only reason it happened is because...
How would you define counterculture today?
The culture had decided this view won.
The gender divide, men are more Republican than ever.
Women are more annoying than ever, yeah. You said it. You said it. We were seeing something bubble up.
In West Village, wearing MAGA hats.
Yeah.
All the headlines this year was that left needs a Joe Rogan. The left had a Joe Rogan. It was Joe Rogan.
The techno-bohemians ultimately
I still love that point
MAGA.
so much. It sounds so much better than tech bros.
I think they're about to steamroll the right.
What's your big lesson here?
First of all, don't go to journalism school.
Yeah. Please make some money.
Leave now. Yeah. They don't care if Kamala Harris goes on Call Her Daddy if it doesn't feel authentic.
Yeah, the vibe check.
Right.
You cannot outsmart the combined IQ of the internet.
If you expand the base of your subscribers, you are much better prepared to weather the storms of change.
You don't want to build a house on a piece of land you don't own.
Yes.
Boomers, whatever.
Lovingly, we say.
Of course.
I was angry about how people who grew up like me were treated by media.
Let's stay on that for a while.
I just felt really...
It's the weekend of inauguration. We'll talk about politics later, but having observed your career and existing in this space, I'm much more interested in talking about journalism in general and new media in general. And in my opinion, having observed what you have done, I think it's a perfect example of how someone can transition from one medium to another. Let's start where you are today right now. You have a successful show, not just in Breaking Points, but your own show. What has that been like, basically?
You know, it's been really interesting to try to build a YouTube channel and podcast, and now there's broadcasting capabilities on X that didn't previously exist. So to kind of go from the ground up has been a super interesting experiment, because when Ryan and I, Grimm, and I stepped into the Hill, Krystal and Saagar had really built a lot of the platform, and they had done it at the time with the help of the Hill's infrastructure, meaning there was a studio, right? There were producers, there was a crew, all that sort of thing. I totally give all of the credit to the success of that show to those two, but there was a pre-existing sort of scaffolding.
Yeah.
And when Ryan and I came into Breaking Points, they had spent a year building up new scaffolding.
Yeah.
So at Unheard, just over the last 6 months, we've been building from the ground up, which gives you an appreciation for actually how difficult it is to nail all of the details that grow new media channels. That's everything from headlines to thumbnails to the tone to upload times and consistency.
Yeah.
It is the wild, wild west, which is really exciting, because if you're somebody who likes to experiment and likes challenges, then this is an amazing space. It can be frustrating because there's not always a clear sort of pattern, and it's all very new. So you're blazing your own path to some extent, but it's actually been a lot of fun, and it's a really interesting glimpse into how things are changing dramatically very quickly.
People from the outside don't really have that, insight on what is that scaffolding that you just mentioned. What was your experience having seen every behind the scenes aspect of the Hill and the Breaking Points, and now having to kind of sort of do it yourself at Unheard, while at the same time also doing the content aspect of it?
Yeah, I think I've learned so much really from Krystal and Saagar. So that was a big benefit, in that Saagar has this incredible intuition for headlines.
Yeah.
And everyone who's worked in media, for the last 100 plus years knows how important headlines are, longer than 100 years for sure. And that, you used to get the paper delivered to you, and you would maybe pick around the Washington Post, and you'd pull out this section and that section, but you paid the same price for the whole product, right? Like the Washington Post gets paid whether or not you read the article on B1. Now, it's not like that so much, unless you're totally reliant on just premium subscribers. You have to entice people to watch everything you put out.
Yeah.
And so the headline space and how it's different on podcasts versus YouTube, if you have a product that's going out on all of those platforms, Instagram, for example, there are some topics that are super hot on YouTube at any given moment that won't do anything on X or on Instagram. But just sort of learning those things, it's I think we see frustration in the legacy media, because you look at some of their channels.
Yeah.
And it's astounding how some genuinely like impressive content, meaning it's done in a professional studio, but it just doesn't take off. And I think they're frustrated. I think part of their anger at new media is because they haven't quite been able to crack the code. Some are now finding a lot of success. Like a lot of the top podcasts come from New York Times or NPR, but there's been a lot of frustration for them.
This year was talked about as the podcast election. We can talk about to what extent that is true and it's overstated, but having been part of one, do you think people put way too much emphasis on the medium itself? I mean, like the Marshall McLuhan quote, like the medium is the message, right? So how much influence do you think it had, like the fact that, we don't need to watch TV for these takes, or was it more of that these takes were unique in themselves? Yeah,
I love that question because from the McLuhan lens, I think that's the better explanation about what happened in 2025. It wasn't just, and this I don't think legacy media understands, it wasn't just that people weren't turning on cable news or getting papers delivered to their doorstep or paying to the Washington Post. It was that as the medium has changed, the expectation of the messaging has changed, to paraphrase McLuhan, in the sense that they don't care if Kamala Harris goes on Call Her Daddy if it doesn't feel authentic.
Yeah, the vibe check.
Right. Like it wasn't a rambling 3-hour conversation where you saw what Kamala Harris was like in the middle of a long discussion. Like, didn't she also go on Howard Stern, a very different version of Howard Stern than, Howard Stern circa 1998. And that's just what people expect now. They expect you to sit for 3 hours if they want to put their trust in you.
Yeah.
And that's, more generationally true. The younger you get, the more that's your expectation. But that is what I think they failed to understand, is that as the medium has changed, the expectation of the messaging has changed. It's not just plug and play. You can't just like sit down on Call Her Daddy and be good to go. Like, check that off the list. You actually have to like get into it. Talk about aliens.
Let's stay on that messaging aspect of it, because I deal with a lot of boomers, whatever, and
lovingly,
of course, of course, our forefathers. But I think there's this approach, just like, kids are watching everything on YouTube now. Take whatever we were doing, put it on YouTube. It's the same thing, but like, let's put it online. What's the difference? Right. As it turns out, there's a lot of difference, and I want you to double click on like that expectation of the messaging. If you were to be like a media consultant, how would you paraphrase that? What is that expectation?
Well, I think it first also has to really change the candidate. Like, I don't know that it would have been good for Kamala Harris to sit down for 3+ hours with Joe Rogan if she couldn't have been likable in 3 hours with Joe Rogan, or at least deserving of the public trust, or the way the public feels like they would trust you after 3 hours. So I think if I were like a media consultant for a campaign, I'd be thinking about this in terms of, is this a candidate who should even try to go into those spaces? And I probably wouldn't want to work for people who couldn't, because that expectation is suddenly so intense. I actually think it's even becoming an expectation among boomers and Gen X, because these mediums are so powerful now. It's not just like Pod Save America, for example, or Rogan. Like, their listenerships are so big. Megyn Kelly is another really good example. I guarantee you that they have significant chunks of older people watching. And I think that means that you have to, if you're going to do those spaces, you just have to be a candidate who can riff. You cannot be somebody who grew up in the much more buttoned up political environment, media environment, and expect that'll translate automatically. Yeah. This could be a problem for Gavin Newsom, by the way. Oh, yeah. Because Gavin Newsom is somebody who I think does really well in a traditional setting. Yeah. Cable news, great. Press conference, great. Would he be likable?
Did you see him on PodSave? And he came he came off a stiff. Like, that point is like, there are a lot of candidates. Like, Gavin Newsom objectively is a charismatic dude. Yes. And I think if he is like packaged properly, he can be a pretty good contender come next 4 years. But that structure aspect of it, he comes off as a capital P politician. Right. Yeah. And I don't think people like that.
No, I think that's really interesting, because you put him in 3 hours with Joe Rogan or whomever, he would gladly do it, right? Like he's so narcissistic. He'd be like, yes, put me in front of the microphone. I have things I could talk about for 6 hours and you would love it. Yeah. But, you know, if you're going to do the version of Gavin Newsom, which I think with a lot of these politicians, they do it for so many years that it's just the version of themselves. Like you probably know this. You talk to some politicians, you know, off camera and you realize that they have just blended into the persona.
Yeah, the switch.
Right, right.
Theater kid, tones on, yeah,
and it's permanent, and it's like I think it's like what they're like in bed with their wives at night. Like they just, you know, they're politicians through and through. You can't turn it off. And I feel like he's probably one of those people. So, you know, he can talk his way through a 3-hour conversation, but he might end up just looking like really unappealing because it's so buttoned up. It's like it reminds me of how Republican politicians, and they still, I'm not sure I've learned this, would go to, you know, they'd be, Mitt Romney's a great example, show up to the Iowa State Fair in like a Brooks Brothers button up and no jacket or tie. Yeah. So, you know, it's like
hand thing, like the
he literally rolled up the sleeves in a Brooks Brothers like
just one of you guys,
up. And this was the consultants dressing you to look appealing to the public.
Like top buttons off already,
Yep, exactly. Trump rolls in and gives little kids helicopter rides at the Iowa State Fair. It's like, I don't know. Part of it is like they want to learn the lesson, but are they capable of doing that is another question. But like if you're really rich, just lean into it. People love success. You know, you don't pretend. And like AOC, I think actually is pretty good at this too. Like if you're not really rich, don't act really rich. Don't act like you're something you're not. It's increasingly getting harder to get away with anyway.
I think my takeaway is that you cannot outsmart the combined IQ of the internet. And you being kind of like you being a fugazi comes off directly. And right now, like think about how we consume content. It's not just like you consuming a piece of video. Like while you're doing it, you're in the coliseum of the comments and you're actively getting a vibe check on what everybody's thinking about while also consuming the content. And that's like the economy where how content comes through. We talked about politicians, but I also want to talk about how the journalists are transitioning or not. You have been on Fox News, you have been on TV shows, you have done broadcasts, and now you're doing this. You have observed other journalists who have done the same way. What do you think is the primary difference besides the obvious, which is once there and once on your pocket?
It's quite interesting because I don't know that I would have been successful in new media to the extent that I am without having the foundation of cable news.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just me, but there is really still something to having the training and having the methodology like ingrained in your memory of there's a camera on and you have a certain amount of time to say a certain amount of things and it doesn't, you can go longer now. I'm not up against hard commercial breaks, but there's still something that forces you to truncate your thoughts into, sound bites and not in a bad way. I really don't mean that in a bad. I think there's really just something to the efficiency of speaking. It's sort of like sometimes people who were columnists with literal inches assigned to them, like in Runaway Bride, like he has Richard Gere has like X inches as a columnist. They tend to be like better writers in general. And I think that's what happened with people who took older media experience and then translated. Like Rogan is a good example. Like the dude was a Fear Factor host. He was doing MMA stuff. And so he had a lot of professional communication training. And now he's just riffing, but he also knows how to do it in an entertaining way. And you can do that without, I think I always tell this story. Like when I was younger, I did like TV training. When I was first going on Fox, it's something that like a nonprofit did back in the day. And person who's very talented at training people and has trained a lot of people was doing it. And in the like mock interview we were doing, I think I responded to one of the questions and said, I don't know, in a very like honest way, like, well, I don't know about that, and the feedback was, don't ever say you don't know something. The producers don't ever want you to say that. But I think, you have to be the kind of person, if you're adapting from old media to new media, to understand that, no, if you don't know something,
just say it.
Say it. People will like you more. And you will also have more integrity.
That's might sound anecdotal, but like that's actually so core
I agree.
like the principle. It's like who you are comes off as what it is. Like on TV, you can pivot, you can be like, I don't know, but like whatever. But like on all things digital, if you just like let them know that, hey man, it's not my field, it's fine. Otherwise you're a clip which goes viral where you are obviously lying about something. Staying on that, you said Joe Rogan. Obviously all the headlines this year was that left needs a Joe Rogan and all that stuff. The obvious conclusion is that the left had a Joe Rogan, he was Joe Rogan, and now they're trying to manufacture, I don't know, Hassan Piker. I don't know who that could be. What was your takeaway from the fact that it's not about the fact that left didn't have a Joe Rogan, but it was a bigger problem in general?
It's totally a bigger problem. It's the left doesn't have a populist, like it no longer has a brand with mass appeal.
Yeah.
And, they won the 2020 election and Donald Trump lost the popular vote in 2016. So to some extent, it's not the most Sisyphean task to climb back up this mountain. On the other hand, it'll be really hard because the gatekeepers of the Democratic Party don't want to relinquish their control and their power and let these new ideas in. And so they're kind of learning the lessons. Like, they know that they probably should have done Rogan, but are they willing to not just do Rogan, but also talk in a way that appeals to Rogan voters? Do they have someone who can do it? Are they willing to let someone in who can do it? That's a huge question. Like, will they let someone through the gates who would be appealing to the Rogan audience? They didn't want to let Bernie Sanders through the gates. That's sure as hell. Like, we know that. So I think that's their big question going forward. Like, somebody who's willing to have, I think, a different take on the culture war. Yeah. Like, they've had the same take on the culture war for 10 years, and the public hates it. The public hates it. Like, the managerial class loves it and demands it, but nobody else likes it. So even just being able to talk about that in like a normal person, I don't know if they're willing to let somebody through the gates who can do that.
You know what's funny to me? I'm 28. When I was coming into journalism, I was like 20. One of the biggest talking points is that, oh, the right is bad at media.
Yeah, right.
And now, almost a decade later, it's like, oh, the right figured out how to do YouTube. The right figured out how to get to kids on TikTok. How do you balance those two? Having existed in the space during that same timeline.
I remember having the exact same experience as you. Back in like the Tea Party days, if you had told anyone at like CPAC 2012 that within 15 years the right would not just command the momentum in media but also in art, jaws on the floor, except for the boomers who were like selling their like weird portraits of Ben Carson. Everyone else would have been like, no way. The boomers would have been like, oh yeah, we got this, we're bringing art back to the conservative movement. And of course they were wrong in what kind of art was going to come back, but it's totally unthinkable. The only reason it happened is because Donald Trump forced the right to be more, I guess, to be looser, you know? And when that happened, all the doors flung open. I don't know how long it lasts because it's countercultural right now. And so anyone who's in the art world will attach themselves to the counterculture. They're already attached to the counterculture. I mean, I remember back in like, several years ago, I was on the set of a Daily Wire movie and just talking to some of the people who got involved in the project. They weren't making a bunch of money, but they were people who had been around Hollywood, like as grips and sound people and makeup people for years. And just to be involved with that project, they were willing to like relocate for, not a lot of pay because they were so desperate to like just do something with their hands and their skills. And when the door opened up, man, it just was like an explosion.
How would you define counterculture today?
The dominant culture, and this is changing literally as we talk, but the dominant culture, from let's actually start it with Obama. I would say the dominant culture from like 2008 to 2024 was the super technocratic, center-left, I would say neoliberal. I think neoliberalism folded a lot of these like cultural, progressive, managerial class ideas into its imperialism and like crony capitalism. So I think that's been the dominant culture since Obama was first elected, probably especially since the second Obama term, when you had Biden coming out, for example, in favor of gay marriage, huge moment in the culture war. Then the Obergefell decision in 2015. It just felt like the culture had decided this view won. And that's where the counterculture sort of became more reactionary, right? Reactionary, and that's been pretty interesting.
My observation on that, when I was in school, obviously all things Obama was going on. I went to school in UK. Half my family lives there, and when I was graduating, like the default settings way of thinking for a journalism grad in Europe was obviously all things Obama, Macron, and that era, and the
Merkel.
And the counterculture was Ben Shapiro dunking on college kids on YouTube, or like back then, I don't know, like Milo Yiannopoulos videos, and like that was like, oh, like we would like hide from everybody and like see what's going on. Like that's the counterculture. And the irony there is that those people ended up gaining huge audiences and actually figured out that scaffolding that you mentioned in the beginning. What do you think are the systems in place right now which is propping up this whole industry of online content?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I don't talk about this a lot. My first job out of college, I worked for a conservative nonprofit called Young America's Foundation. And I'm still involved with YAF in some ways. But what was interesting about the time out of college is that it was I graduated in 2015, and that was, people probably can pinpoint this, when Ben Shapiro started to go stratospheric. His career had been meteoric up until that point. Like he's had so much success already, even at that age. But in 2015, I remember it was after, at the University of Missouri, there had been this BLM uprising, because these are the BLM Obama era days when that was becoming a very tense cultural space. And it was just, I think they were trying to, I forget exactly what the demands of the BLM protesters at Mizzou were, but they were like kind of funny. They were laughable. Like, they were what's now called woke, but it was funny stuff. And so I remember devising with Ben's team and a lot of people at YAF, like, let's just do an emergency speech let's send Ben Shapiro to Missouri, and it's going to be like an emergency event. And it started taking off. And then he went to California State University, Los Angeles, and the now you'd call woke protesters, like they blocked people from getting into the lecture room. And we did like a live stream from inside the room as kids and Ben were like trapped. And it was, I remember I was like, this is really good content. And I didn't, nobody was thinking the word content at the time.
No.
But I feel like what happened, and we did this again at DePaul in Chicago. They didn't want Ben to speak, and so we recorded him. We sent a camera crew to record him trying to get into the venue and being stopped by the police.
So guerrilla.
But it's Ben, right? There's nothing guerrilla about Ben Shapiro, but because the culture, the dominant culture, was being so rigid and politically correct. Ben was the one that
rebel.
As people started to get upset with I think part of it, like, Ben is brilliant. Part of it is like he could have done everything right and still hit a ceiling if the dominant counterculture wasn't so bad. And the reason
you think so?
Yeah, I think the proof of that is because it all shattered during COVID. And I think when people it was exposed for how censorious, like, I don't think if COVID hadn't happened, I don't know that any of this would have really hit the high watermark that it's at now.
Okay, there can be like two reads off that, which is that during COVID, the fact that, people had nothing to do and a lot of content got consumed and people figured out what they actually like. And the second read can be that during COVID, there was this top-down approach.
That, I think.
Of, shushing whatever isn't the kosher approach, whatever. And you think that's the more viable one?
Yeah, I think it's that. Although I also think it's the democratization of media, meaning that it was easier for Ben to start a media company in the Daily Wire without, all of the traditional infrastructure that you would need, meaning he didn't need to buy like a building in Manhattan to start having mass consumed broadcasts. So I think it's a confluence of those two things. I don't think it was necessarily that people were like stuck at home and watching a bunch of stuff. I think they were pissed that they were stuck at home.
And what?
If that makes sense.
That's such a good way of putting it. Because like in its sense, like it was basically talk radio on Facebook. But I know, right? So, and obviously now it is way more than that, and they got people like Brett Cooper, so it doesn't just feel like talk radio on Facebook mom content, but it's like basically good content.
But it literally is talk radio on Facebook for like Dan Bongino.
Yeah, basically.
And for Buck Sexton and Clay Travis.
And if you think about it, it's the same audience, by the way.
Yeah. Although you've sort of brought in, it's funny you say that, because I was thinking about this recently. You've brought Gen Z into talk radio in a weird way, because what talk radio, and Howard Stern is a really good example, used to be was just, I mean, they had commercial breaks, so it was a little different, but like it was one guy in a microphone. And it was them filling that space for hours. And conservatives would always talk about Rush Limbaugh as an artist. And I think it's performance art, absolutely. What he was able to do with just a microphone. And so I think there's something to that. It was, what are people like when there's no hair and makeup?
Yeah.
It's just them talking.
Yeah.
That's what I think a lot of talk radio was.
Just to drive that point home, the common saying in TV is that, what's your job, by the way, if you're talking to talent, hey, what's your job? Oh, my job is to fill airways between ad spots, right? Compare that to talk radio, which is you yapping for an hour in someone's ear. And like, that's like the definition of a parasocial relationship. And like today, like people who are like younger or whatever, they're getting that same kind of content, but that format was ironically kind of shaped in that era.
You know, and I grew up outside of Milwaukee, kind of roughly the Milwaukee area. And in terms of conservative talk radio, Milwaukee oddly has one of the most robust talk radio cultures in the country. And so it was really common in the area and in the suburbs, especially for blue collar guys, and actually even some people in like cubicles, to leave the talk radio stations on all day, and just it was a very passive experience of just, you know, you're making dinner or you're changing tires and you're listening to the local, it was literally Charlie Sykes at the time, like was the most popular person in Wisconsin talk radio. And so that, I feel like with Gen Z is why talk radio on YouTube, it's sort of similar in the sense that, you know, you've probably seen the reports about Netflix making people write into their scripts like what you're doing at any given moment in a TV show, because people are watching it while they're doing laundry and they want to hear, I am getting up and leaving the room right now, because it helps them follow when they're consuming something. Like, I think it's partially that these old things that used to feel really produced now can feel a lot different. Just because we're just trying to drown ourselves in media.
Zooming in on all things which happened post-podcast election, obviously, as we talked about, the right kind of mastered that medium and ended up kind of sort of building a diverse coalition. I live in New York. I work with a lot of tech entrepreneurs, a lot of media entrepreneurs, and also a lot of news people. I would have never expected a lot of those people to align politically, which ended up happening. I'm not even talking about blue collar, white collar. I'm talking about like the different vibe check within city people. And somehow the right kind of brought them together. Now, post-election, obviously during Christmas, all things immigration Twitter, we saw what that first fraction looks like. And my big read is basically, if I had to do the Venn diagram thing, like the new right, let's call them like tech right, and the MAGA right, the only overlap is being anti-woke, being pro-free speech, and hating the other side, while having vastly opposing ideological stances on all things, what it means to like America in general. How do you, like, having worked in like the right media, if you say, how do you see that marriage being a happy one, if even?
You know, my sense at this moment, and I feel like this is changing by the week, but my sense at this moment is that the techno bohemians are going to steamroll.
That's awesome.
That's the best way that I think. As I think of it, that's kind of what I see from a lot of the folks, just like aesthetically and culturally, is I think they're about to steamroll the right. And I think, you know, a lot of the... When
you say right, you mean...
I mean the Republican Party, really. Okay. And I'm like the broader conservative movement. You know, Steve Bannon is a man of the conservative movement. Like the last 20 years, he's been a creature of the conservative movement. He didn't start in the movement, but he commanded it. Like, he's a guy who always would have been haunting the halls of CPAC, for example, or, you know, you'd see him at different movement events. You know, he understood what Ronald Reagan really created started in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or William F. Buckley, some people would say, and Reagan like catalyzed. That was the movement that Steve Bannon was a part of, although he was always kind of genuinely on the cutting edge of it. And he's the guy right now trying to be the bulwark against the conservative movement getting steamrolled by the techno right, by, you know, Mark Andreessen. And my sense is that there's so much money from Elon Musk and Mark Andreessen, and really the people who, I say this not as a pejorative, but worship at the altar of Tesla and SpaceX for some good reasons. Like, this stuff's amazing. They have so much money and influence that I have a really hard time believing that, even though Steve Bannon probably represents the median Trump voter better than Mark Andreessen, I think what Donald Trump is really enjoying, the TikTok battle is the best example of this. Like, putting the CEO of TikTok on the inauguration dais, like, is amazing. Yeah. That, as a statement, it looks to me like Donald Trump is sort of opening up the gates, or he's like greasing the he's greasing the wheels and letting he wants it because he likes the adoration, and he thinks that he can co-opt them. I don't know that he can. Yeah. But that's the tug of war.
I think the change in vibes, all things, how the coastal tech people view the right has been fascinating, especially for me to observe, because like I'm the kind of quote unquote guy on right which everything Steve Bannon would hate. Right. And I've existed in like the VC space and the tech space, and the guy who was in the forefront during all things immigration, Sriram Krishnan, he's like one of my friends, and I know the things he believes in, and I know like what his definition of being on the right means. And I was talking to Rokana this morning on all things that same immigration debate, and
he had some fun with Laura Loomer during the Christmas war.
That's where I draw my line on Twitter. As soon as I like find a Loomer quote, I was like, I've been too long here. I was like, whatever, gotta get out of here. But I think one of the more fascinating quotes which I saw was the old Teddy Roosevelt quote, and which can be kind of surmised as like, America's cool, America's awesome, we have open doors for anyone who wants to be an American. However, there is no space for an hyphenated American. I'm Indian, there is no Indian American. You're an American. However, there are a lot of people which I kind of sort of agree with, by the way. However, there are a lot of people who kind of sort of identify being on the right who also have pride about being that hyphenated American. I have this root, I am a tech guy, I'm a media guy, I'm an immigrant, I'm this and that, while I'm also saying fuck all things woke. As of now, like that whole Bannon version of right seems like, we don't want you. We won the election, we don't want you. Is that a good read?
So I don't know. It's interesting. The people who, I don't know about Bannon himself, I don't want to speak for him, but I think the median Trump voter would have no problem with people calling themselves Irish Americans or Italian Americans. And part of the reason, I think, even though those ethnicities were not really considered quote unquote white by like WASPs in New York, New England at the time, I think the reason that it all kind of melted together is that there was an assimilation that the Bannons of the world don't think can happen from other cultures, and that is totally debatable. I think they're terrified about what's happened in the UK, but Indian culture is not the same as Middle Eastern culture, and I think there's a conflation that happens. I think also it's like, so for example, one of the best examples, Thomas Sowell writes about Nigerian immigrants. And how Nigerian immigrants, he uses this as a way to say there's no unique like racial reason for some of these discrepancies in wealth and prison and stuff among Black Americans and white Americans. And he talks about how Nigerians just assimilate fabulously and have very successful lives in the United States. And I think that's the most charitable version of why the right is more hesitant about people who have had problems assimilating into other countries. But it's easy to conflate like South Asian, Middle Eastern. I shouldn't say it's easy. I should say they make it easy.
to quote the Vivek tweet, it's the big C word.
Okay, first of all, hilarious. But second of all, like, isn't that a good example of why it's like, dude, stop. Yeah. Like, you're doing a really bad job of explaining this to your critics. And and that's not to say the critics are right. Like, Laura Loomer is not correct in that debate, but neither is Vivek. And this is why the politics are, this is why the path to, like, sort of coming to an understanding is hard, because, like, both of the dominant strains here are out of touch, I think, with, like, the median Trump voter, who in many cases have, like, interracial families and love, like, new people, different foods, different cultures. They travel. Like, nobody's representing the medium person outside of New York, DC.
I have so much to talk to, but since we brought up that Vivek tweet, like, I was drunk out of my mind. It was like the football, like, on Christmas was going on.
Yeah.
And it was like I was scrolling through. I was like, fuck, like, racism. And then it was, this Vivek tweet. We laughed so hard at the bar. I read that tweet out loud to a bunch of my friends, and they were like, is it what it's like to be Indian, dude? Like, are you in that much pain? I was like, maybe, I don't know. But, like, that tweet was like, okay, like, I'm an immigrant, and I was like, let's talk about why most immigrants move here. It's not because they want more of, like, fucking nerds. They want all things high school movie culture.
Blue jeans, baby. Yeah,
and I was like, you're, like, doing a horrible disservice. Like, you're only talking about what your childhood was like and what you want your ideal employee to be.
It was like projection.
And I was like, dude, people have to live lives. Like let them live. Like, is like one of the, like, I don't know, like, I'm kind of a libertarian. I was like, people just want to chill out and live, and you are right now saying everything which people kind of sort of point fingers for, like, right to be, hey, you are stiff, you need to be more chill. And Vivek was just, like, being, I don't know how to point it. And I was talking to Saagar about it, and Saagar is also kind of like, he's the opposite of that. On the other hand, so my Indian parents kind of sort of raised me like Vivek's Indian parents did, while at the same time I was also like, you know what, that's cool, but I also want to be liked by other people.
That's funny.
Talking about more all things, this whole new right media, I worked at Daily Caller. We saw overnight how all things Facebook changing its algo kind of sort of vanished a lot of news publications, and it was funny watching that whole thing come to full circle during Zuckerberg on Joe, when he said that, hey, we're going to go back to what it was. To bring more context to this, there was this thing called fact checking in Facebook, which basically means that other news companies get to fact check other news companies, and more often than not, those kind of lean on one side, which kills traffic to the website, and ergo kind of sort of like takes the business out, basically. And I've existed in the digital media space while that was going on. Do you think it's kind of like a return to normalcy in terms of, like, will those business come back, or do you think Facebook and Instagram will just be Wild West?
That is, like, the $1 trillion question, because, you know, this is, I know a lot of people at the caller right now, because it's inauguration weekend, are reflecting on the fabulous inauguration party that they co-hosted with Facebook, which you've probably heard about before. It's sort of legendary.
I know.
At the Hay Adams. So very swanky.
Classic
on the eve,
DC establishment.
Exactly. Yes. On the eve of the 2017 inauguration of Donald Trump. And they had a Facebook Live booth set up so this is 2017.
This is brutal.
Yes, right. It's brutal because and you may remember this, they built a set in the newsroom, and of course they built a set in the newsroom. Like, Facebook was telling people to invest in Facebook Live. And, you know, even at the time, people had, like, in IJR, Independent Journal Review, they had Vine people, right?
They're not on right anymore, right? They're gone.
Oh, I think they exist in, like, some anemic capacity, but, like, they were getting big on Vine, and so they invested a bunch into Vine. And, you know, Benny was doing a lot of their Vines, and Benny now has a really successful show on YouTube and podcasts. So it's just, like, there's always, I think what the conservative media, and I should say independent media, so even places that aren't conservative, like the Free Press, like explicitly conservative, have learned, is that you need to have, like, this really solid product that can translate from medium to medium, and don't put all of your eggs in the Facebook box, because as soon as Zuck turns that switch, flips that switch because Hillary Clinton's yelling at him, you're losing millions and millions of dollars overnight. And then you have to start from scratch on another video strategy. And it takes you years to build out of that hole. So I feel like people are just better prepared.
Yeah.
Like TikTok is a really good example. That was limping along before the pandemic. The pandemic happens and TikTok changes the economy, the daily lives of Gen Z, like that overnight. I mean, it was the craziest thing. And I think people are learning that you can't anticipate what's going to come next. So you just need to build a really good product that you'll be able to put in one place and the other. Because it's so hard to predict now.
What do you think of the fact that right now most of our communication infrastructures are so hyper privatized and commoditized? I'm not saying that there needs to be NPR and like public radio and that's the only thing, but like all these people's livelihood vis-a-vis our friends kind of sort of depend on, people like Zuck and Musk. It's kind of like a yelling at the cloud point. I totally get that, while at the same time there's an aspect of that, okay, that's happening, accept that, and now it's your job to own your audience, which something like Breaking Point's nailed it. So if you had to kind of like be the media professor talking to the sophomore in a media school, what's your big lesson here?
First of all, don't go to journalism school.
Yeah. Please make some money.
Leave now. Would be the first thing I would say. But so take Breaking Points as an example. The Breaking Points right now is something that you can access via Locals.
Yeah.
And Locals is not something that I don't know that it even existed before 2021. I think maybe 2020, somewhere around there, when it becomes clear. I actually meant to go to an event the other day about the quote unquote parallel economy in the next Trump administration, because you remember this, like there was VC going into the parallel economy. Like Don Jr. is a big investor in Public Square. And in 2020, when you had every company bending the knee, literally in some cases, to causes that felt really alien to a lot of America, like there was this idea that you had to have a parallel economy. Parler getting kicked out of the App Store was the shot across the bow.
Yeah.
That made people say, let's start investing in literally being able to host our own websites outside of Amazon and sell ads outside of Google. So that is, but Breaking Points doesn't, I think, politically need Locals. I shouldn't speak out of turn because I have zero influence in that business stuff. But I would say that that moment feels like it's past, and right now you see a lot of conservatives putting their eggs in the tech basket and saying, come up on stage, TikTok CEO, or Jeff Bezos, who via Amazon Web Services, people were having problems. I mean, it's just insane how quickly the right now thinks that it can co-opt them because they are giving them millions of dollars, and it's this transaction that's happening. And I don't know that that's permanent, and I think it's enormously problematic that there's such concentration here. So there is no, right now, I worry that the energy that was going into breaking up that concentration, both via the government and antitrust activity and via investments in these parallel economy things, I worry that that's all going away. Because if I were talking to a sophomore journalism student, I would say you have to, you just need to have a skill base that translates, no matter if this all becomes co-opted by old media and the tech oligarchs and whatever happens there. You just need to have skills that are going to translate from A to B, because right now I have no idea. I have no idea what's going to happen.
Regarding a lot of young people who started doing commentary during, especially post-COVID, we saw people like Brett Cooper being as big as most of the cable news channels. And the point I'm trying to make is, I think there's the same story of bundling and unbundling over and over again. Someone gets big, someone joins a company, the company benefits from said content, then they get too big for the company, they become a prima donna, they want to leave, and then there's this whole debate and they leave, and then the company's like, okay, we have to start over the show again. So if you had to empathize with both ends of the stick here, the brand and the talent.
So like Brett and the Daily Wire.
Bingo. Yeah. And how do you think in that situation someone like Daily Wire should approach said talent?
Yeah. They've been smart because they've diversified beyond Ben, because Ben really was the sun that the Daily Wire revolved around, and I think to some extent still is.
Yeah.
But I think it's more the tone that he sets for everyone else. So they can lose Brett and they're still stable, and so I actually think they're a good model for other people in the business sense, that you just you can't build up around one big person. Like, first of all, people can. Shapiro was talking about this the other day. This was in a profile by Variety, I think, or Deadline, one of the two, saying he was talking about another media company being a one car crash company, and you don't want to ever be a one car crash company, quote unquote, in this economy, because you're just too vulnerable.
You're over-leveraged.
Right. And so I think, they took a huge hit when Candace left, and I'm sure they're taking a huge hit with Brett leaving. But I mean, PodSave has a bunch of hosts. Like, Favreau can decide he wants to move to a monastery and they'll be okay. But there are a lot of brands that actually aren't like that. And that's tough. So I see some, like, all of the interest right now in big investors taking over some of these successful podcasts or companies, new media companies. I find to be really frightening, because people know that this is a vulnerability, and so they'll be really tempted by some of this money to solve the problem. But I think you might lose some of the spark.
Shifting away from, like, the business aspect of it, the reason I really like talking about the podcast stuff, because we saw, like, how directly it affects the coalition building of the election. And because of podcasts, in my opinion, I think this election especially overemphasized the gender divide. And because of all, I don't want to even, like, dive into, like, the sociological, we can actually, like, the sociological problems which kind of led to the fact that men are more Republican than ever, women are more liberal than ever. We can talk about why
women
that is.
Women are more annoying than ever. You said it. You said it.
But it's the caller in me coming out. But because of all things TikTok and podcast and Andrew Tate clips and whatever on everyone's feed, that point drove home. How much effect do you think that, like, medium has in how young dudes are thinking today? Especially given the fact that they aren't being talked about by capital C culture at large.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. I mean, one of my college internships, I also talk about this a lot because it was a wild ride at the exact point in time that you would want to be watching this space, so to speak, which was 2012 to 2014. I worked for Christina Hoff Sommers at the American Enterprise Institute, and we were working on the re-release of her book, War Against Boys. But towards the end of my time with Christina, Gamergate was happening.
Oh boy.
And Milo was at Breitbart, and I think I don't think it was before he was at Breitbart, but at the time it was, we were seeing something bubble up. And Christina was getting trashed. She was trashed in the early 90s, and she was getting trashed again. But interestingly, she was becoming this cult figure. Yeah. And I think it was profiled in the intellectual dark web piece that Barry Weiss did for the Times eventually. And what we saw was this massive underserved audience who was now being able to find validation in YouTube videos and Twitter accounts, and they were places to talk to each other that weren't just like kind of nerdy forums or really dark places like 4chan. It was sort of like normal people could find other people saying what they wanted to hear, and on like more immediate things. So they didn't have to wait for a book to be published about Gamergate. Someone was like talking about it on YouTube, and they could interact with that. And so I think that was the beginning of what blossomed into the manosphere that the left is now sort of pejoratively referring to. And it's because the left ignored them for so long. And I think it's great that men have their own language. Portnoy was huge in this, and he's not even really a primarily political figure, but he saw, like, culturally, politically, what was happening to men.
I think one of the bigger, one of the more fundamental articles written was the coining of the term Barstool conservative.
Yes, Matthew Walther in the week. Yes.
And I was like, holy shit, I've never, like, it felt like I was reading something which, as corny as it sounds and as much Saagar would hate me, I felt like I was being described in an article. And I was like, yeah, that's actually true, because I live in a city, I do these things, while at the same time I kind of don't relate to all things corporate garbossy culture or whatever, even though
but you're not with the religious right on abortion aesthetically, right? Like aesthetically,
the cosmetic aspects of it, even though like a shit ton of my friends is like who work in the collar, who are in this quote unquote right leaning conservative commentary, and I was like, we are friends, but like I don't share majority of my opinions with them. However, at the same time, when I hang out with my New York friends, I was like they are chill with all things pronoun culture and woke stuff, and I'm like, okay, that's a little too much. I just want to chill out and watch sports. So like that, what's the balance there? And that was the first time when I read that piece, I was like, okay, cool, that makes sense for me. I don't know, I'm 28, I might change. Staying on that lane for a while, what do you think is like the future of all things coalition building? Because we were talking about it earlier. Right now, the Republican tent seems like it's too big for it to sustain like this. And like you said, your prediction is that all things Elon Musk right will kind of sort of steamroll the Bannon right. What do you think? How do you think MAGA is defined post that?
Yeah, it's interesting because even as you were saying that, I'm thinking to myself that George W. Bush's compassionate conservatism did steamroll the kind of Pat Buchanan moment that was springing up at the time. So like a lot of this is you get these dramatic swings back and forth that feel like they're happening gradually, but then when you can look back and say, well, this happened over the course of 10 years, you know, it's not that gradual. We can swing back and forth really quickly. And so I think, you know, MAGA, all of this is, you know, it'll probably age poorly in, 6 months, even after just seeing what Trump does. Yeah. You know, does he stick with Musk? Does he have a massive falling out with Musk? That is determinative, hugely determinative in and of itself, because Trump is not fundamentally an ideologue, other than sort of having this populist take on trade and immigration. Yeah. That's his ideology, is what he defines as patriotism. And so if he has a lot of tech people that are giving him money and they're in his ear and they're saying X, Y, and Z, and, you know, they let him do whatever he wants on visas. They allow him to hire Stephen Miller and let Stephen Miller do what he does, but he protects their monopolies. Yeah. Which I think is probably most likely. Then, yeah, I think they've successfully steamrolled MAGA. It becomes a much smaller thing centered around, it kind of goes back to what it was during the 2015 primary, which is, centered around Breitbart. And maybe now it would be centered around the War Room. And that's kind of the media center of it. And, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say because there's so much dissent to those things. But, like, on the other hand, if Ben Shapiro is getting what he wants to see from the Trump administration on foreign policy, is he going to be super upset about different things downstream of that? Like Shapiro probably agrees with Bezos on foreign policy. Yeah. For the most part, would be my guess.
This is in hindsight, but when we're leading up to all things election, my friends were talking about, what's going to happen now. I have the advantage of hindsight, so I feel comfortable saying it. This one night we were at the bar, and we saw two college blonde chicks in West Village wearing MAGA hats. Yeah. And we were like, okay, like, what's going on? And we went up and talked to them. They were like, obviously Red Scare fans.
I was going to say, surprise. It was Anna and Dasha.
Yeah, I was surprised. And I was like, okay, like, I don't know, like, those people do exist, but like, now that they feel comfortable being outside, I was like, okay, that's the vibe shift everyone's talking about. And my whole, not concern, my curiosity is like, what happens to the cultural cachet of, it's okay to be that now.
And I think this is exactly why the techno-bohemians ultimately
I still love that point
MAGA.
So much. It sounds so much better than tech bros.
But I think this is why they ultimately steamroll MAGA, because they are the ones that have the cultural energy, and Bannon is not. Yeah. And like, yes, Bannon is a Seinfeld guy who still coasts off those billions, but he is not like a cool guy. Yeah. It's like, I know Anna and Dasha think that he is the best dressed man in the world. And
he actually, I like that jacket.
I don't hate the look. But he's obviously not, Antonio Brown, who's like genuinely like he's cool, right?
Yeah.
Like he's cool, and so that's why I think like, does Antonio Brown give a damn about the
Federalist
policy
Papers.
priorities of banning world and banning voters? No, he wants like a common sense border policy, but he's not going to be parsing the difference between H-1Bs and like, you know what I mean? Like he doesn't. The caps on H-1Bs, like, no, he's not going to be parsing those differences. He's more likely to sort of be steered by where the cultural energy is.
Yeah.
And the cultural energy right now is with TikTok, and that's why TikTok's winning. That's why Trump, who was going to ban TikTok, is now bringing them up to the stage at the inauguration. He's not just saying like, hey, I like you guys. He's bringing them up to the stage. He's including them in the MAGA universe. And so that's why I think it's much more likely that MAGA gets co-opted, and what you see is something that's in a policy and substantive sense, more MAGA go into just take a smaller form.
Yeah. Bring it back to all things you and your content. You existed in spaces which did news for the right. Then you were at the Counterpoint show, you still are, where you have an archetype, I'm guessing, and now you have a mic to yourself. How do you think of like what your content stands for and who you're speaking to?
So the funny thing is, one of the biggest pieces of feedback I get on Counterpoints is to kind of argue more with Krystal and Ryan. And that's really funny to me, because where I'm most comfortable is just kind of asking questions. And I do have some really strongly held opinions, but I don't care that much about a lot of them, if that makes sense. Like,
you don't care about winning on like on the matters now.
I don't have that in me.
Yeah.
So like, if someone prompts it, like if someone says something that like I find really annoying or what, like I honestly usually like I don't even try, but like my natural instinct is like to joke, just because like it's like, okay, it's kind of funny, but it's so basically that's the one people will be like, oh, you're different on Megyn Kelly than you are on Counterpoints, and it's like, well, if I'm being prompted to talk about something that I have a strong opinion on, like, okay, I can do it. I have a strong opinion on things. But if I'm trying to, like, one of the cool things about Breaking Points is that I like to learn. And in that environment, I'm like, what can I learn about what Ryan thinks? And so, honestly, my approach to things is, I remember it's seared in my memory being told not to say that you don't know something. And I remember...
How old were you when that happened?
22. And I remember thinking immediately, because there's different reasons I went into media. One of probably the primary reason is that I felt like, I was angry about how people who grew up like me were treated by media. And it just, it turned into...
Let's stay on that for a while. Like, how do you think that anger kind of sort of like manifested? Like, not like in a vicious way, but like, let's define what it meant to feel like that. Because a lot of that kind of like shaped as the Trump circa first election. But in terms of media, not a lot of people who are like, let's say like 16-year-olds whose first experience of election and election content and political content is TikTok. If you were talking to them, how would you describe that time of all things news media and how they spoke to America in general?
You should go back, if you don't remember this, and watch the Taylor Swift video for You Need to Calm Down, because that video was way behind the times. It was really tone deaf when she published it. This is probably my most like successful drudge link that I ever got, was a piece in the Federalist about, it was like an hour after the video came out, and I remember my jaw just being on the floor about how offensive it was to the people who made Taylor Swift rich and famous. It was like people in middle America. She depicted all of these toothless rednecks like protesting gay marriage. When I went up and I looked it up, and let me tell you, the group that had the highest opposition to gay marriage in like 2018 or 17 when that video came out was Black Americans. She would never do that, right? Like never. And so it was just like, that is how things were before Trump came along. It was that video on repeat on every damn television show. And there was this brief period of the sort of cringe counterculture you had a lot of people during the Obama era like watching Duck Dynasty.
Yeah.
And
Oh my God. Yeah.
Duck Dynasty.
Yeah.
But every country music song became about trucks and beer,
Yeah,
and
and
it was
jeans.
it was because people were being shown the "You Need to Calm Down" video on repeat over and over again for a decade plus at that time, and a lot of it came out of George W. Bush being stereotyped and depicted as this like idiot Texas redneck because he said a lot of really dumb things and was a really unpopular president. It got extrapolated, and the kind of Obama technocrats felt like they were winning, and that was really, really frustrating. Like psychologically, I think one of the things that drives me more than others is is this frustration. It's not even really an anger, it's just a frustration with being misunderstood. And I mean that in like not being misunderstood as a human being, but being misunderstood in a point you're making, or about something you believe in. And I just felt really misunderstood on behalf of, people who, like, it sounds stupid, but like went hunting and fishing and listen to country music, and like it just drove me crazy. And I think that was sort of like the magnet that brought me into media. But also, I love media. Like I was reading Mediaite as a teenager, like Refreshing Drudge Report. I remember the day the Daily Caller launched. I went to it right away. I've told Neil that before, it just. I love media, and now is a great time to love media.
I love talking about like these kind of origin stories because, like, I remember Saagar telling me that, hey, why'd you come into the media? For him, it was like all things 9/11 and everything that came after that. And your point about being misunderstood.
He was falsely accused of doing 9/11.
Well, he didn't have the beard back then, so because I know Saagar
much less suspicious
pre-beard and pre-expensive teeth.
Can you say that?
But like to your point about being misunderstood, the first time I personally understood that was when I was working with a campaign for American Conservative Coalition, ACC. They basically do their whole shtick is basically that, hey, like, conservatives were the original environmentalists.
It's Benji's group.
Benji Backer's group. And he was the one who brought me into that whole lore, and I was like, yeah, holy shit, that's actually true. And all things Teddy Roosevelt National Parks was like, yeah, we are like the environment, the nature party somehow, because of the fact that the right has sucked in doing media, the left took the steering wheel of all things Greta Thunberg, and we are the party of all things being a tree hugger.
That's super interesting.
And
they had cool art too, right?
They had great art.
A good aesthetic.
I know. They understood the power of vibes. Yep. And that was the first time I realized, okay, yeah, like media has this much leverage, and that was just like me. That happened while I was coming of age in all things conservative media and politics.
That's interesting.
Last question for you is, once again, you have a mic to yourself now. You are the host of your own show. You're not only a journalist, but you kind of sort of are the talent of like one big media show. Do you like to think back of your come up as something which led to this moment, or do you think it just happened because of all things podcast elections and this was the right time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm successful enough to do that yet, but I do think, even as I was just talking about how much I love media, like it just, to me, the reason that moment of saying, you don't say I don't know, is seared into my memory is that I remember at the time, I'm a millennial, I was thinking like, man, I bet if you did say you didn't know, people would like that.
You got it, yeah.
And I actually have always maintained that the best show on cable news in terms of the production is Morning Joe.
Yeah.
Because as insufferable as the content is,
they're chilling.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. They have their Starbucks cups out. They're freewheeling. They're texting. They get phone calls in the middle of it. And they've been doing that. They've been doing it in that way for a really long time. And so for me, it was just sort of, I think there are a lot of people, Saagar is one of them, definitely, Krystal is one of them, who always understood that there were things that needed to change if these dinosaurs wanted to survive.
Yeah.
And what happened that I don't think people expected is technologically everything opened up, meaning it just became way easier to do your own show, people, if you were like what Saagar and Krystal were doing during the 2020 primaries is suddenly seeing that people, they've talked about this in the New Yorker actually, wanted something that looked like cable but did not sound like cable. And so they found out a way to do that without cable. Yeah. You can look like it, but now, the way that you, like, now it's just much, much easier to do that. You can start a website. Like the Federalist, that was 2014, I think it started. The Caller is a good example. You don't need a literal printing press.
I feel like I have the agency to talk about this because my company does Breaking Point's production. Yeah. And while they were shifting their set, the biggest thing which Saagar wanted to drive home was like, hey man, I want to feel my young bohemian fans should feel comfortable sending Breaking Point's links to their boomer dads because it passes the smell test and it's not in front of like an exposed brick in someone's basement. It looks like a news show, but it represents all things that is Breaking Points.
Can I say that is so prescient though?
Yeah.
And to have been involved in that, like, gives you such an advantage because what he was really thinking there is not just this is going to be a better product, but what he was really thinking there is that we are going to expand the base.
Yeah.
And now if you expand the base of your subscribers, you are much, much better prepared to weather the storms of change in terms of platforms and in terms of appetites culturally.
Yeah.
And so he's so smart, but what he was really thinking there is like, we can get people who are not just millennials, and now Gen Z, of course, but also like boomers to subscribe.
Yeah.
Like that. I don't know that he's ever put it that
product,
way.
Yeah.
But I'm like, as we think about it, like that's clearly just so smart on their behalf, Krystal and Saagars, to think that way. Because that is going to be the people who weather the storm will be of new media will be building their houses on the rock and not in the sand. And a lot of people are built in the sand right now where it is someone in front of a brick wall and it's just them. And like they could pony up $200 for the Shure MV7 so their audio sounds great. Or maybe they've got all of their like Elgato products and they sound and they look good, but
one of my mentors said it in the perfect way, which is you don't want to build a house on a piece of land you don't own. Mm-hmm. Right? And that applies so much to new media because you have no say in how the algorithm treats you.
And that's why locals is really important.
Yeah.
And again, I have absolutely no like interaction with that on the business end, but that's what came out of 2020 is that if Apple... If let's say Trump doesn't like something that Saagar is saying, just hypothetically, it wouldn't happen, but yes, let's say he gets mad, and then on his behalf, Elon Musk gets mad, and hypothetically, Saagar had done his show in a production deal with X that suddenly fizzles. And loses literally all these subscribers that you've built over years and years. You might have an email list and you can try to coax people to bring their subscriptions somewhere else. But the benefit of these companies is that they are hypothetically able to weather the storm of Amazon Web Services, Google Ads, getting demonetized, which they tried to do to us at the Federalist. Like those tech changes have allowed people to build their houses on rock instead of sand. And that is really important. And I think it bodes very well for new media.
While that change is happening, what do you think happens to cable?
Cable, I think we've seen actually Fox News, I think CNN, they actually have pretty good presences on YouTube. Yeah. And I think a lot of what they should be doing, I actually don't think MSNBC is the dumbest thing to buy. Because I think if you bought MSNBC and tried to hire Hassan Piker and found a way to I was just talking about this the other day with Ryan. Pat McAfee was bought by ESPN. Nobody has done that in cable news yet, right? Like nobody has been the Pat McAfee who was doing their own thing and then was co-opted and he does really well on all of the platforms and cable now.
I think that's because it's news and politics and they don't want to give all the levers to someone as much of a bohemian as Hassan is, which like the product is great, but okay, let's talk about it. So when ESPN hired Pat, their whole thing was, okay, we'll let Pat be Pat turn Pat into Stephen A, right? That was the whole pitch, and there was a lot of actually internal discussions and debates.
And he fought back. It wasn't an Aaron Rodgers.
Aaron Rodgers, the COVID thing, and being able to swear and all that stuff.
And he won.
He's the thing. And I think it all comes back to like who you are making content for. And as it turns out, a lot of cable news company and a lot of people who are employed in the city do the news for people in the city. They don't do the news for the internet or for the people, but as it turns out, the power and the eyeballs are in the latter.
Right.
And I think that's a really smart observations. Like MSNBC is not the dumbest thing to buy, and
they're not affiliated with Comcast, right? If you buy them, you won't have to answer to the Comcast board or NBC Universal. Like, you don't have the hundreds of people in Midtown scrutinizing every breath that's taken on the airwaves. You could keep it at something that's smaller. You don't need to beat Fox News in the ratings, but you can pare back dramatically, like tons of cuts, lower your overhead, and start making income on YouTube and podcasts. And, actually, we talked about this earlier, but some of these old media platforms are dominating on podcasting. And like podcasting in particular is full of like the New York Times and NPR if you're looking at the charts. MSNBC, a couple of shows. I think Morning Joe does pretty well as a podcast.
Yeah, which pisses me off, if I'm being honest.
It's annoying, right?
Yeah, and I was like, you don't belong here. Go away. Yeah.
But the reason that they do well as a podcast is because everyone is now listening to podcasts. Yeah. It's no longer the niche Rogan consumer. It's everyone. And so if you lower your overhead somewhere like MSNBC and you do something where it's not just that for business reasons you have to let people swear and platform Aaron Rodgers, but that you actually are going to you're going to make more money and you're going to be kind of cool if you do it. If you can have some tolerance for that, you could do a lot with an old cable property like MSNBC. And so I think it's what's being tested right now, and McAfee's a good example because he won, but what's being tested right now is the executives' willingness to take a couple L's. And
one of them got fired.
Yeah, see?
Yeah.
So will they take the L's of all the layoffs at the Post and everything? They're going to have to lower their ceiling at a lot of these old media places because, again, literally you don't need printing presses anymore to compete with a place that has a printing press. You can get page views similar to the Washington Post. And you didn't need a printing press. You just need a freaking domain from GoDaddy. It's not that hard.
I need a fun place to end at, so I will let you do one prediction for the next year. All things post-Trump inauguration.
Saagar shaves.
Nice.
Is that it? Yeah. Let's see. A prediction for the next year.
Well, this year.
2025.
Yeah.
Ooh, this is, I don't know.
Well, let's niche down. Okay, what happens to TikTok?
What happens to TikTok?
In 3 days.
They will I think, here's a good one. And I'm going to look like an idiot probably in a week, but someone close to Trump doesn't have to be his best friend, but someone close to Trump will buy TikTok. China will, because there was a leak this week to the New York Times that China was considering a sale to Elon Musk, and they had never tacitly leaked anything like that before.
So it was on Bloomberg too. So
Bloomberg, yeah, which has good sources over there, surprisingly. So that to me was a signal when push comes to shove. If the Supreme Court went the way that it went, they would then sort of maybe have their bluff called. And I think it'll get sold to somebody who's, whether it's one of those PE guys or Musk himself, Kevin O'Leary. That's my prediction.
Cool. Emily likes TikTok. The end.
No! I kind of liked it at first, but...